Although the borders have shifted, it is still true that the people of Libya were on the doorstep of Egypt. These Libyans had many names, but the name that is officially taken is Put. The word Put itself is seen as a growing word that was used first by the Egyptians. This word must have expanded with the Egyptians as it was used by the Persians. This is the hieroglyphic way of writing it, and this is the Persian cuneiform of writing it. The way that the Persians wrote the name gives us a clue to how the Egyptians would have said it, as the way you say it in Persian is Putaya. The ya at the end is a suffix meaning location. That's why the kingdom of Kush was known as Kusaya in the old Persian language, and that's why the name for ancient Egypt was Mudraya. This word is the origin of the word Misr or Mizraim, which is the Semitic word for Egypt, and that's why there is no Egyptian equivalent. The Libyans are well attested for in the table of races by Darius, where you can see Arabs, Egyptians, Lydians, Iodians, Scudrians, Ionians, of course, Libyans, and right next to them, Ethiopians. They represented the western part of the world. Although this information is fascinating, it still does not tie Libya to the main roots within the Iranian or Persian Empire, as Darius built the road between Sardis and Susa. These two places were connected because they were seen as the main exporting areas. But now that we know what word the ancient Egyptians used for the Libyans, what role did these Libyans play in the history of West Africa? In order to figure this out, we have to go back in time, around 1800 BC. In this timeline, what we find is that there are two civilizations that start off completely independent, but will end up in the same place as a giant unified civilization.
That there were Nile Valley migrations to West Africa, particularly after the Roman incursion into North Africa. Many of the blacks in North Africa left North Africa and they migrated into the inner body of Africa. And that includes West Africa, not just West Africa, but unfortunately, the way people are miseducated today, they're under the false impression that the Sahara was empty and that the only people in the Sahara were light-skinned, miscegenated North Africans, and that's false. If you ever want to, I would just suggest that you Google the term Kanem Bornu, Kanem, Kanem Bornu, Bornu, the Kanem Bornu state. It was a black African civilization, and it basically comprised all of the Sahara from the north to the south of it and was directly adjacent to Egypt. If you spit in Kanem Bornu, it would land in Egypt.
Although the Kanem Bornu civilization would be the final stage of the Kanem Empire, it goes back at least 1,800 years. In Nigeria, a culture called the Gijugana culture started to flourish. This culture had spread by 700 BC to Chad. In Chad, as seen in the picture on the right, in Chad, they started building architecture that was similar to that found in Nigeria. The Gijigana culture starts off at the late Stone Age in Nigeria, and expands with the Iron Age, fusing the two cultures in Chad that existed and the culture in Nigeria. This Nigerian culture that brought iron to Chad was very strong, and seemingly it developed another civilization known as the Sao civilization. This Sao civilization had about the same technologies that you would find within the Nok civilization in Nigeria. It expanded its borders and headed for Libya. The history of this area is very complicated. And so, if we wanted to figure out who these tribes were, we would have to go through them one by one. So, in the middle, we have the Kanem Empire being represented. So, right now, what I'm highlighting is the Libya side of Kanem. This is historically tied to ancient Egypt, as these tribes have been warring and gaining both populations and people from Egypt. The second one is the Nok culture. This Nok culture is a representation of a peopleage that had discovered iron and had created art completely independent of any other place in the world. And then in the center, there is Chad. But this place is complicated too, as the Nok civilization seems to have existed at the same time as the Kanem civilization, almost completely independently, having nothing to do with one another. So the question then becomes, who are these people? Local names disappear and they are replaced by Greco Roman names. As we can see here, there are a couple places mentioned. These places that are mentioned here are very important because they signify modern areas. And I will tell you and show you a map of exactly where these places are. But first, let us read. At the outset, when writing of the journey from Garama to Ethiopia, he says that Septimus Flaccus, having set out from Libya with his army, came to the land of the Ethiopians from the land of Garamantes in the space of 3 months by journeying continuously southward. He says furthermore that Julius Meternus, setting out from Leptis Magna and Garama with the king of the Garamantes, who was beginning an expedition against the Ethiopians, by bearing continuously southwards, came within 4 months to Agasimbia, the country of the Ethiopians where the rhinoceros is to be found. It's important to note that the rhinoceros is found in Chad, and the place that is being mentioned as Agasimbia is 100% in Chad. If we look at this map, we can see clearly highlighted at the bottom Agasimba. The orange line signifies a journey that could have been taken by the Garamantes all the way to Agasimba, which was mentioned by Ptolemy, reporting on Leptis Magna. Now, it is important for us to pay attention to this map. Look at the very top where Mauritania is. That's the Mauritania that we're talking about when we talk about the Moors. It is important not to mistake this Mauritania with the modern Mauritania, especially when we read the next part. This will tell us how connected North Africa was to Central Africa and then West Africa. The time period from this reading would make it so that the Sao civilization had already existed and the architecture that existed there had already existed, as this is in AD, while the Sao civilization started around 500 BC. He says, in agreement, therefore, with the information that the inhabitants are Ethiopians, as those who have sailed there have told us, Marinus describes that the region of Agasimba, Chad, and the promontory of Prazum and the other places lying on the same parallel as situated all on one parallel, which is opposite the parallel passing through Merowe. Merowe, of course, being the historical civilization that is related to Kush in Sudan. This is why it makes it very interesting that we find an instant that shows us that these civilizations are connected in ancient times, which they would then be in later times. But going back to those early civilizations we were discussing, the Nok culture, which was the Nigerian, the Chadic culture, and then the Libyan culture, you can tell here that they're being represented, except for Nigeria, of course, at this point. What then we can find out is how connected are they? One thing that we should absolutely first talk about is the fact that in this writing, they're talking generally about large scales of people, except when they talk about the Garamantes and they mention that they have one king and they stretch a large place. In fact, the accusation made is that the king of the Garamantes holds Agasimbia. So if you remember, I said, make sure you know where Mauritania is, and you can see it right at the top. And the reason for this is because it comes in handy when he tries to place all of these regions into one small paragraph or two paragraphs. Interior Libya is bounded on the north by Mauritania, Africa, and Cyrenaica along those lines, which we have mentioned as their southern limits, on the east by the part of Marmarica along the meridian passing through the town Darnus and extending as far as mentioned terminus of Marmarica, then by Ethiopia, located below Egypt. So this would be the area of Merowe as well. Then, along the same meridian to the terminus, which is located in, it is terminated on the south by interior Ethiopia. Interior Ethiopia would be Central Africa, in which is the Agasimba region. I'm going to say that again, in which there is the Agasimba region. So it's definitely Chad, and it makes sense even today. And along that line, which we have said runs in the western direction, now we're going closer to Nigeria, to the Bay of the Outer Sea, which is called Hesperus, or the Great Bay, located on the west by the Western Ocean from the bay, which we have mentioned, to the terminus of Mauritania Tangatina. You can see over there. So we start off at Mauritania, go towards Egypt, Cyrenaica, and all those places, and then we go south to Merowe, go west to Agasimbia, and then go north to Mauritania Tangatina, northwest. So, what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that not only could these civilizations be connected, but they were definitely connected and they shared with each other technologies. It might be, since we don't find cotton that early in West Africa, that the idea of spinning cotton came from these Libyans, while the idea of ironworking came from these Nigerian styled West Africans, who then had a fusion with two other groups, which are the Merowites or the Kushites whatever you want to call them. In this central region, it became an Ethiopian fusion area or Ethiopian melting pot. You have Libyans going down, you have Nigerians going up, you have the natives of Chad staying put and going east and west and around also, and then you have some Sudanese people moving in. This is historically attested for by the multiple languages that exist in Chad. But it's not just that. The writings themselves tell us that this fusion of Ethiopians built one of the biggest Ethiopian empires that might have existed, which were the Garamantes. Gaetolia is located below Mauritania. The desert of Libya below Africa and Cyrenia. The great race which inhabit Libya are the Garamantes, extending from the source of the Bagradas River to the Nubus Lake. So we're talking about extending from the north all the way to Nuba, the river of Nuba, and the race of the Melanogaitali who occupy the land which in between the Segapola Mountains and the Ursagala Mountains, and the Ethiopian race of the Gire who dwell towards the south from the Gur River, the Niger River, and the Ethiopian race of the Nigrite who are north of the Niger River, and the Doradi who dwell along the river of that name, Doradas, where it empties into the sea, and the Perosi who are more to eastward and more remote from the sea, as far as the mountains which are called Theon Okema, and the land of the Ethiopian Odregdei, located between Kaphis and Thala mountains, and the Manicus who are below the Thala mountains, and the Nubia dwelling on the western side of the Garamantica defile, and the Debrica who are towards the west of the Aranicus Mountains. So you can see here the very little Ethiopian groups that are described, and then the large Garamanti groups, which, according to this, go as far as the Niger from the north, and then go to the west all the way to the Nuba. This makes them an extremely large race. And so 100% the Libyans are connected. But forget Kanem Bornu. Their first connection is the Garamantes. Now, I know I've read this part 100 times, but it's such an important part of the history of Africa that I have to read it again. At the outset, when writing of the journey of the Garama to Ethiopia, he says that Septimus Flaccus, having set out from Libya with his army, came to the land of the Ethiopians from the land of Garamantes in the space of 3 months by journeying continuously southwardly. He says, furthermore, that Julius Metrinus, setting out from Leptis Magna and Garama with the king of the Garamantes, who was beginning an expedition against the Ethiopians by bearing continuously southward, came within 4 months to Agasimba, the country of the Ethiopians where the rhinoceros is to be found. Each of these statements on the face of it is incredible. First, because the Ethiopians are not so far distant from the Garamantes as to require 3 months' journey. He then adds that seeing that the Garamantes are themselves, for the most part, Ethiopians, which I will take that to mean that some part of them is not, and have the same king, secondly, because it is ridiculous to think that a king should march through regions subject to him only in a southerly direction, when the inhabitants of those regions are scattered widely east and west, and ridiculous also that he should never have made a single halt that would alter the reckoning. Therefore, we conclude that it is not unreasonable to suppose that those men either spoke in hyperbole, or else, as rustics say, to the south or towards Africa, to those who prefer to be deceived by them rather than take the pains to ascertain the truth. In part two of this video, we shall talk about the fact that the Arabs themselves write about these people, and they speculate that the Garamantes could have been responsible for the Ghana Empire, and they also speculate that the Garamantes could have been responsible for the Kanem Empire. This is exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about a civilization that Arabs, Greeks, Romans, Egyptians, everybody pretty much knew that this area was connected to West Africa. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, did you say the ancient Egyptians knew that the Libyans were connected to West Africa? 100%. Well, how do I know this? Well, it goes back to a story told by Herodotus about Xerxes. See, Xerxes sent out a few men to go and circumnavigate the globe, but these men were unsuccessful, instead turning away in West Africa. This information goes back to Herodotus, and it comes back to the Persians, and the Egyptians had heard about it too, which is why in a later period, these Egyptians try again under a different pharaoh. It's 600 BC. The Phoenicians, who are very close to the Egyptians, have a conversation with the pharaoh Necho. Necho says he wants to know how big the continent of Africa is, and so the Phoenicians go on an expedition, traveling past Morocco, around past modern day Mauritania, going around and eventually landing back to Egypt. But first, they document some of the stuff that they see, which comes to us through Herodotus. The reason he wanted to do this was because he realized that the Libyans themselves had great access to the other side, but that domain was not his. It did not belong to the pharaoh. The Libyans had direct access through land to go to West Africa. The pharaoh himself did not. He had to use the oceans. For those of you that are interested, this is the exact page that they talk about circumnavigating Africa. Well, at least Herodotus talks about it. And you can see there that he mentions the Pillars of Hercules, which is that narrow gap between Iberia and North Africa. And then he mentions how they go past this and around and end up in Egypt again. And then he mentions other stories of people who tried to go around Africa but only landed up in West Africa, and then they had to go back. Like, for example, if you go all the way down and you see the word Xerxes, from there say, from thence going to King Xerxes, he told him that in the most distant part he sailed past a nation of little men who wore garments made of palm leaves, who, whenever they drew to the shore, left their cities and flew to the mountains, that his men, when they entered their country, did them no injury, but only took some cattle from them. Of his not sailing completely around Libya, this, he said, was the cause, that his ship could not proceed any further, but was stopped. Xerxes, however, being persuaded that he did not speak the truth, as he did not accomplish the task imposed upon him, impaled him, inflicting the original sentence, a eunuch of the sentence, blah, 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 blah. There is so much that we can go through with Herodotus about what he knew about Libya, and him literally saying that Libyans came to Egypt and told them, who lives on the other side of the world, that if you go to the furthest parts, you continue and see more Ethiopians, which is absolutely true. But this is not about the furthest parts of Ethiopia. These are about the closest areas to which we have evidence that during this time, right? So there's places like Rapta and all those places. During this time, there's an area in Chad where we start to find items that were made by Egyptians and ended up in Chad. So I'd like to say this. Last time when I read these, I was talking about Rapta and Azania and all of these places, but they are connected to Agassimbia or Agasimba. And Agasimba is one of the most neglected places historically, even though it is one of the most interesting places and well written about. This place is Chad. It has the oldest, greatest civilization that was written about outside of the common that we see Libyans, Ethiopians, Egyptians in Africa. Thank you for watching.